I was living in my childhood bedroom when my parents kicked me out, laughing at my failure. Little did they know, I was making more money per minute than they made in a month from a classified government contract worth $40 million. My name is Lee, I'm 31, and I moved back into my parents' house on a Monday morning that smelled like burnt coffee and quiet resentment, dragging behind me a rolling suitcase and the kind of silence that follows failure you can't explain. The room hadn't changed, same floral sheets, chipped white dresser, posters curling at the edges like they were trying to escape. It was eerie, sleeping beneath glow-in-the-dark stars that once gave me comfort, now a constellation of mockery above a grown woman who used to lead a team of 30. I told myself it was temporary, that this wasn't the end. The first thing my mother said when I came through the door was, "How long do you plan on staying?" Not welcome home, not even a tired hug, just cold logistics, like I was a house guest she'd never wanted. My father didn't speak, just turned up the volume on the television, some History Channel rerun about war tactics, and I stood there, in my work shoes and trench coat, wondering how a place that raised you could feel so foreign. That night, over overcooked rice and silence, they asked no questions, just chewed and occasionally glanced at me like I was the topic they were politely avoiding. I didn't tell them I left on my own terms, that the resignation was strategic, or that the company I helped build was burning quietly from the inside. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. I'd learned a long time ago that my wins never sounded real to them unless someone else validated them. They wanted external proof, titles, headlines, a LinkedIn announcement with 5,000 likes. Anything less was failure dressed as delusion. So I said nothing, and in their silence, they filled in the blanks themselves, deciding I had crashed, that the golden child had finally fallen like they always suspected she would. It was my mother who made the first cutting remark, while I was helping her fold towels in the laundry room. "You know, I always said you weren't built for leadership," she said, without malice, like she was recounting the weather. "Too sensitive. People like you break." I kept folding. The scent of fabric softener made my throat tighten. My father chimed in at dinner. "Maybe now you'll stop pretending to be the smartest person in the room." The next morning, I found my resume tossed on the kitchen counter with red pen corrections, as if I'd submitted it to them for grading. By the end of that week, my mother stopped looking me in the eye altogether. She walked through the house like she was trying not to trip over something embarrassing, and I realized that something was me. My father started calling me the boomerang, a joke he thought was clever, and I smiled when he said it because I still hadn't unlearned the urge to make them feel comfortable. Every day, I woke up at 6 a.m. just to feel like I still had discipline, like I hadn't unraveled completely. I applied to jobs I didn't want and made calls I never intended to follow up on. The morning they kicked me out, I'd just come back from an interview, the kind where the interviewer's eyes glaze over halfway through your pitch. My mother was waiting by the door with her arms crossed. "You've overstayed," she said, as if I was a tenant breaking a lease. "It's humiliating. You're 31, Lee. Sleeping in a twin bed in the house we raised you in." My father walked past her, handed me my suitcase, and didn't say a word. I stood there for a moment, holding the handle, waiting for someone to soften, but the room stayed frozen. I didn't tell them I had already signed a government contract worth $40 million. I didn't tell them the project I'd been quietly building in my spare time was now the backbone of a classified defense system. I didn't tell them because they wouldn't have understood the language, the scope, or the weight of what I'd built in the dark. They didn't deserve to know that the failure they were mocking was the most intentional decision I'd ever made. So I said thank you, wheeled my suitcase to the sidewalk, and walked away without looking back, not because I didn't care, but because I finally did. And that's the last time I saw the house as theirs. I stayed in a small Airbnb after they threw me out, one of those bare apartments with gray furniture and a smell like old soap, the kind of place that doesn't try to be anything more than a roof and a lock. The silence was familiar though, comforting in its way, because for the first time in weeks I could hear myself think without dodging disappointment. Every evening, I opened my laptop and watched the contract numbers change, licensing fees, defense stipends, quarterly projections. I was making more per minute now than I used to in a month, and still, I didn't tell anyone. The deal had been in the works for almost a year. a secret I nursed quietly while pretending to care about quarterly OKRs and board meetings that felt more like performance art. My real work started after hours, long past midnight, buried in lines of code that didn't just secure networks, but reshaped how communication could hide itself. Quantum encryption built from scratch, untouchable by brute force or standard logic. I spent 3 months encrypting the encryption itself, and when I finally demoed it in a classified briefing, the room fell silent in a way I'll never forget. That was when I knew. The company I helped build didn't deserve it, which is why I never gave them access. My co-founder, Caleb, had been sloppy for months, dropping hints about pivoting into surveillance tech, taking lunch meetings he wouldn't admit to, letting client logs disappear without backups. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the data showed everything. Competitor overlap, IP timestamps, internal files accessed from third-party devices. I documented it all, screenshot after screenshot, file transfer logs, meeting transcripts. It was exhausting, like quietly exhuming a body everyone else insisted was still breathing, but once I had it all, I made one call to the bureau. The agent's voice was surprisingly gentle, like she'd done this before. I didn't ask what would happen to him, didn't need to. I handed it over and let them draw their own conclusions, and in return, I got what I asked for: a clean exit, a controlled narrative, and a $15 million settlement buried under an NDA so tightly worded it might as well have been in Morse code. The board called it a strategic departure, and LinkedIn lapped it up. There were articles, one podcast invite, a few congratulatory texts. My parents never saw any of it, which, frankly, was the point. People like them needed failure to feel superior, and success, real, unpolished, unsponsored success, had never been something they could sit with. So I disappeared from their version of the world, blocked their numbers, changed my address, wiped my online presence clean. I created 3 LLCs with unsearchable names and opened bank accounts in 3 different states, all linked only through a 4th shell company based in Nevada. The encryption tech fed the cybersecurity firm, the firm fed the venture arm, and the venture arm purchased real estate. It was a closed loop, and within 9 months, the system ran itself. I kept things modest on the surface: a rented car, a simple apartment, 1 laptop, because wealth without anonymity felt like bait. I used burner numbers, signed contracts under pseudonyms, and worked mostly through encrypted messaging with people I trusted to keep their heads down. The only person who knew anything beyond my first name was Alex, and that was because he'd earned it. We met at a government conference, of all places, standing next to a coffee table neither of us wanted to approach. He was sharp, quiet, had the look of someone who'd seen too much and still chose decency. I didn't plan on trusting anyone, but trust isn't something you plan for. It's something that builds in the pauses between questions, in how someone listens when they could be judging. He never once asked me to explain what happened with my parents, or why I flinched every time someone praised me. Instead, he taught me how to shoot straight, how to sleep without leaving lights on, how to move through a room without making it about you. He didn't need to understand everything about my work, he just respected it. And I think that's why I stayed. By the time our engagement ring arrived, discreet and simple in a navy velvet box, my net worth had passed $200 million. I still hadn't told my parents anything. Not about the contract, the companies, the money, or the man I was going to marry. They didn't ask, and I stopped pretending I'd ever owe them answers. Some stories are too big for small minds to carry, and some truths aren't worth the breath it takes to explain. I let them believe I failed, and I left the rest to silence, the same kind they gave me when I needed them most. It was a routine finance review, nothing unusual, just a folder of properties my real estate arm had acquired through a distressed portfolio sale. But when I saw the address, my chest stopped mid-breath. Their street, their number, their house, the one with the pale yellow siding and cracked front steps I used to paint every summer. I checked the acquisition paperwork 3 times, ran the chain of ownership backwards, and there it was, their mortgage, bought at 52 cents on the dollar through a shell sale. Without knowing it, I had become their landlord, and somehow, that felt less satisfying than it should have. I sat with it for a while, the strange weight of it, this quiet authority over a space that once didn't want me. I could have raised the rent or sent a notice immediately, but I didn't. I waited. Let the calendar breathe. Let them send in checks addressed to a faceless property management firm I controlled through 3 layers of paperwork. I read the maintenance requests without emotion, approved the plumbing fix they couldn't afford, even comped the pest control visit when the attic mice came back. They had no idea whose name was buried behind the wire transfers. For months passed before the payments stopped. The last one bounced twice before disappearing altogether, and then the emails started polite at first, then apologetic, then increasingly desperate. My assistant forwarded one that made her uncomfortable. "We're going through some financial difficulty," it said. "We just need time to catch up." I asked her to hold off on responding. It was strange seeing my parents' words stripped of their pride, bent into humility by necessity. The same people who mocked my so-called failures were now quietly pleading for mercy from a system they believed was indifferent to their names. The eviction notice was automatic, triggered by policy after 90 days, a standard letter written in neutral legal tone, signed by a lawyer I'd never met in person. I didn't rush it. I gave them the full grace period, extended it once without explanation, then again. But eventually, the numbers tipped too far, and I had to choose whether to let them fall or catch them one more time. I thought about it longer than I care to admit, stared at the signature line for an hour before I finally clicked send. I didn't feel powerful. I just felt very, very tired. They called me a week later, or at least they thought they did. The number routed to my firm's general line, and I answered without telling them who I was. I listened as my mother begged to speak with someone about their property, her voice breaking in places she used to sharpen like knives. "We just need a few more weeks," she said. "We're not bad people, we've just hit a rough patch." My father took the phone midway through and asked for the name of the owner. That was when I told them calmly, without flourish, that I was the one they owed. There was a pause, then the line went silent, like someone had dropped a glass. My father asked me to repeat myself, and I did, once. He tried to laugh, like I was bluffing, but my mother was already crying. I didn't interrupt. I let them sit in it, in the realization that the daughter they'd discarded was the person holding their roof in her hands. They asked if they could meet, offered to drive across the city, begged for a conversation. I declined. Told them they had 30 days. The rules didn't bend for family. Especially not for the kind that forgets you're human. I mailed them a printout of the contract they'd signed, the payment history, and the full balance due. I highlighted the late fees in yellow and included a prepaid envelope they could use if they wanted to clear the debt. They never used it. Instead, they sent one final email and signed, just a few lines, "We didn't know. We're sorry." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever received, and still, it felt like it came from strangers. By then, the house was already being prepped for listing. I told my realtor to leave their name out of all public documents. The night before the listing went live, I drove past the house, slowly, window down, watching the lights flicker through the blinds. It looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile somehow. The porch steps still sagged at the edge. The mailbox still leaned left. I parked down the street and sat in the quiet for a few minutes, waiting for something, anger, grief, maybe even guilt, but nothing came. Just a strange stillness, like the air before a storm that never arrives. I started the car, pulled away without looking back, and let the house slip into memory, one street lamp at a time. The email from the investigator arrived 2 days after the eviction notice was delivered, buried under mundane subject lines, unassuming in its tone, but I opened it the moment I saw the file attachment, parental history, final. The report was brief, just 6 pages, clinical and unadorned, with hospital records, transfer forms, and a single scanned birth certificate I had never seen before. My last name was there, but the mother's name wasn't my mother's, and the signature wasn't hers either. I read it 3 times before closing my laptop, the words swimming in quiet disbelief, then total stillness. The woman who raised me, who criticized everything I did from the way I chewed to the men I loved, hadn't given birth to me. They had adopted me when I was 16 months old, during a period when my biological mother was living below the poverty line in Portland, working night shifts as a CNA and surviving mostly on frozen meals and the kindness of her landlord. The record said the adoption was closed, the kind where you're never supposed to meet again, the kind people used to treat like secrets you bury under carpeting and cheerful family photos. I spent the night going through old boxes, yearbooks, birthday cards, family albums, looking for a trace, any trace, that might have hinted at the truth. But everything I found only confirmed how little of me had ever belonged there. The baby photos started late, with none from the hospital, none from home. My mother always said we lost a bunch in a basement flood, but I realized then how easily truth can be edited, how whole childhoods can be reframed around selective memory. The erasure wasn't cruel, it was methodical, as if they wanted to forget they hadn't created me. When I called, she answered on the second ring, voice cautious, like she already knew something was coming. I didn't raise my voice or ask her why, I just asked one question: was I adopted? There was a pause, not long, but long enough to confirm everything. She sighed, then said, "We were going to tell you eventually." Her tone wasn't ashamed, just tired, like she'd already made peace with the decision decades ago. "You were difficult," she added after a moment. "Not like other babies. You didn't bond." I closed my eyes, hearing in that word the weight of years misunderstood. My father took the phone next, didn't deny anything, just added that they tried their best, which was always his way of ending a conversation before it turned into accountability. I listened in silence, let him talk, waited until the air between us grew stale, and then told him the eviction would proceed as planned. "This changes nothing," I said, and meant it. They had not only abandoned me when they thought I had nothing, but they had done it twice, once in truth and once in spirit. The first time, I was a baby. The second time, I was a disappointment. I didn't respond to the follow-up messages, the ones that came at midnight, rambling and scattered, full of soft rewrites and half-excuses, asking if we could rebuild now that everything was in the open. I forwarded the last of their mail to their new address, a rental property on the edge of town, and signed off on the property deed transfer the next morning. My attorney asked if I wanted to pursue legal damages for unpaid rent. I declined. Some debts don't belong in court. They belong in silence, in the long space between a question and a truth that arrives too late. A week later, I received a letter, real paper, handwritten, the first in years. It wasn't from them. It was from the private investigator. At the bottom of the envelope was a phone number, and below that, a name I hadn't seen before, Margot. My birth mother. She had asked, gently, if I'd be open to contact. Said she'd respected the closed adoption all these years, but never stopped wondering who I'd become. "Even if it's only once," she wrote, "I'd like to hear your voice. I won't ask for more than that." I held the letter for a long time before deciding. That night, I called her from my car, parked on a side street near the waterfront. Her voice was soft, unsure at first, but when I said my name, she started crying in a way that didn't ask for pity. She didn't ask for forgiveness or explain why she let me go. She just said, "You deserved better than what I could give you then." I didn't know what to say to that. But I stayed on the line, listening to the sound of someone who had never once left my name behind. For the first time in years, I felt like someone's child. Spring had almost arrived when I found myself back in Oregon, standing on the porch of a house tucked into a street I'd never known but somehow felt like it had been waiting for me. The air smelled like damp cedar and lilac, and the mailbox still had her last name etched into the metal, Wren, simple and clean. Margot had passed away the year before, quietly, according to the lawyer who met me in a room full of dust-softened light. "She left everything to you," he said, sliding a folder across the desk, the house, the land, and a trust. I didn't cry, just stared at the papers with her signature on the last page, wondering how someone who never knew me managed to leave something behind like she had always planned to. The house wasn't large, but it was warm, wrapped in pale blue siding and stories I'd never heard. In the living room, there was a shelf filled with journals, all dated, all marked in her handwriting. She'd written to me every year, letters never sent, moments never shared, and in each one, she called me my girl, as if she never let go of that name. I spent 3 days in that house, walking through each room slowly, reading with the patience of someone who finally had time to understand where they came from. Her bedroom was painted in soft colors, her clothes still hanging neatly, untouched, as if she had expected someone would come for them eventually. In the kitchen drawer, I found a photograph of her holding me, younger than I had ever imagined, with a tired smile and a hospital bracelet still on her wrist. On the back, she had written, "First day, last day, but you were always mine." Back in Spokane, the listing on my parents' old house had closed. A young couple with 2 kids moved in, painted the shutters, replaced the mailbox, and planted sunflowers in the yard. I drove by once, watched the children drawing on the sidewalk with chalk, their laughter bouncing off the same walls that once echoed with silence. The steps had been repaired, the siding washed clean. It looked like a home again, not a battlefield. I didn't stop. Just let the memory fade into something smaller, something less sharp. Some places aren't meant to be returned to, only released. Alex met me at the airport with coffee and one of those quiet smiles that said he didn't need the details to understand what mattered. We drove home in silence, windows cracked, wind threading through the car like a second conversation. At a red light, he reached for my hand and didn't let go, and I thought about how many things I'd left behind to end up in a life that finally fit. I told him about the house in Oregon, about Margot's journals, about the photo. He didn't say much, just nodded, and that was enough. I kept one letter, the last one Margot wrote, folded inside a book I always travel with. It was short, just a page, written the month before she passed. "If you ever find your way here," it read, "I want you to know that I never stopped hoping you'd find your way to yourself. Family isn't what you're born into. It's what grows when someone stays, even in silence." I've read it so many times the corners have softened, the ink fading into the paper like something that was always meant to be there. We had dinner with Alex's parents that weekend, and they welcomed me like I'd always been there, asking about work and life, without weighing my words like they were measuring worth. His mother hugged me on the way out and said, "You're exactly who he needed." I didn't correct her, didn't explain the long road I took to get here, just smiled and said thank you. It was enough. Some truths don't need to be spoken out loud to be felt. Some closures don't slam shut, they fold gently, like pages turning toward a quieter chapter. I used to think vindication would feel like winning, like standing on some mountaintop shouting the truth into the wind, but it didn't. It felt like peace. Like walking through a home that was left to you without strings. Like hearing your name spoken by someone who never forgot it. Like being held without needing to explain the weight you carried to get there. In the end, I didn't reclaim anything, I just let go. And sometimes, that's the more powerful story. Not the one where you come back. The one where you stop needing to.